Welcome to our 2022 Minority Rights Annual Lecture, and good evening to all, those in presence here at Eurac and those listening in streaming, in particular the students from the University of Innsbruck and the University of Florence. We know that we live in a time of crisis and scarcity of energy, scarcity of freedom, of rights, of rule of law, and we learned from the COVID pandemic that social, economic, and political crises have a more pervasive negative effect on most vulnerable groups, in particular on linguistic, religious, and cultural minorities, showing us how diversity and vulnerability are often intertwined and interdependent parts of a vicious circle. We also know that the concept of minority protection has been one of the oldest concerns of international law, finding its origin in the rise of the nation state. And the main idea of the protection of minority has been always to combine equality and diversity. But another important concern has always been a security concern. So the securitization of ethnic relations, so avoiding violence, avoiding civil war, have always been the main short-term concerns behind the most international and national treaties on the protection of minorities. We also know that minority protection has also been very often misused, as in the case of Germany and the alleged protection of the German-speaking communities triggering World War II. And this abuse of minority protection as a pretext to invade other sovereign countries has left minority rights and minority protection with a poor reputation. At the same time, we all thought that, especially after the war in the former Yugoslavia, this was something belonging to history that we had put aside, at least as Europe is concerned. But the aggression of Ukraine by Russia has clearly taught us that we were simply and utterly wrong. Minorities are still misused as a pretext, as an excuse to intervene militarily and invade other sovereign countries. At the same time, minority rights seem also to be no longer easily accepted by many states. And this is coupled with a profound crisis of many international institutions responsible to prevent tensions and conflicts. And the scandal of the European Parliament is just one of the most recent and perhaps not the most shocking one. In this gloomy scenario, there are also positive signs, perhaps to be seen as sort of drops in the ocean. And one of these is the recent consultative status within the United Nations finally granted to the lead organization representing one of the most oppressed and stigmatized minority groups in Asia, a consultative status that was arbitrarily blocked for 15 years. And this reminds us how relevant is the work of a truly independent civil society within our communities and within international institutions, as one of the most important and precious barriers against the oppression of minorities. So with all of this in mind and reflecting on the situation of minority rights in the world, should we be more optimistic or pessimistic? Where is the pendulum swinging? More towards minority protection and the politics of difference and diversity, or more towards a politics of sameness, homogeneity, assimilation as the only way to maintain prosperity and the global order? So we have the honor to discuss on these issues with our distinguished guest of today, Fernand de Varennes, who is an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria, adjunct professor at the National University of Galway in Ireland, and visiting professor at the University of Hong Kong. And since 2017 is also UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues. Fernand de Varennes will have a presentation entitled "It's Time for Legal Protection of the Human Rights of Minorities, a Critique of current gaps and failure. So thanks, Fernand, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Grazie Roberta. Guten Abend, buonasera, bonsoir tout le monde. Maybe I should make one correction. I'm no longer a visiting professor at the University of Hong Kong. Issues have become very complicated around the Uyghur minority and the Tibetan minority, which essentially means I am persona non grata in Hong Kong. First, many thanks to the Institute for Minority Rights and the Center for Autonomy Experience for the honor of giving this year's annual Minority Rights Lecture on the theme of whether it is time for the legal protection of the human rights of minorities. And I would propose to do this in three parts. First, beginning that minorities are badly protected legally in Europe and globally. Secondly, that the situation has reached a critical point, and that change is urgently needed or urgently needs to be addressed. And thirdly, contrary to what many observers and certainly state authorities often might claim, it may be absolutely necessary to have legally binding obligations, an international treaty on the human rights of minorities, because the current gaps and omissions are so glaring and worse, so bad that they can no longer be ignored. But before I begin, I have a question for you. How many of you have heard of Harry Potter and the series, TV and the movie and book series? I think most of you have know this series. Okay. Remember the character whose name could not be actually used. Actually, he was described as he who must not be named in the Harry Potter series. Well, we have something like that even at the United Nations, where you have situations of UN staff, experts, or rather activities of the United Nations, where there is clearly reluctance and even refusal to use the word minority, as if it is an evil concept or dangerous concept, as a matter of fact. And this is not a joke or an exaggeration. As I pointed out in my 2021 report to the UN General Assembly on the socio-economic participation of minorities, the word minorities was actually intentionally removed from earlier versions of the enumeration of those left behind. Vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples, women, migrants, persons with disabilities, older persons, children, and youth for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this was done without any explanations. Now, let me repeat that. There was a list, quite an extensive list, of vulnerable groups in order to try to identify factors or indicators in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In the early versions, minorities were always there. And yet, at the final step, almost at the final step, the word minority was removed, completely extracted, eliminated for the identification of those who are, in fact, quite vulnerable in the area of sustainable development achievements. So, and there are many more examples like that. Minorities are those who must not be named in a number of areas at the United Nations. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon, last 10, 20 years, that this has been occurring. And I would even suggest that this is a discriminatory exclusion of minorities in the strategies, for example, for the Sustainable Development Goals and other areas, which must be called out. It actually has to be identified as occurring. And one has to question why it is occurring. And there are many factors, and I think you can surmise that for some states, the issue of who is a minority or not a minority, or whether we should talk about minorities, is sensitive. There are governments who do not want to talk about minorities. Let's put it aside for now, because we will return to the actual content of this evening's annual lecture. On the first point, if you remember, Let me insist that minorities do not have the same level of legal protection of their human rights that do most other vulnerable segments of society in international law. And I would say that's actually pretty much the case here in Europe at the regional level, whether you talk about the European Union or, in fact, the Council of Europe. And I'll come to that back in a few moments. Let's go back in time, however, a little bit. There was, as many of you may remember, there was a drive to develop political commitments and legal protection in a particular period in Europe, when there were Europe and elsewhere, involving dramatic upheavals in the late 1980s, 1990s. You will remember that this is the period where you had conflicts such as the breakup of Yugoslavia, the war in Bosnia, of course, but there was also separatist violence in Corsica, France, Basque Country, Spain, Northern Ireland, in fact, still at the time, and many other parts of the world which occurred often, and I would even suggest perhaps mainly involving competing majoritarian nationalism and grievance claims from ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities. And just like today, because if we look around us today, there are very dark clouds around the world. And once again, conflicts is a recurring issue that we need to deal with. But just like today, in the 1980s and 1990s, it was a particularly dark period in Europe, a dark period which required and resulted in significant political and intellectual efforts to address. And what I mean by that is that this is the context which led not only to the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities, but also the adoption of instruments and treaties such as the Council of Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, the creation of the mandate of the OSCE's High Commissioner on National Minorities, and the adoption of the Copenhagen membership requirement for a country to join the European Union, which included stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for and protection of minorities. This is not an accident. The list that I enumerated all happened at approximately the same time in the historical context of Europe, but also other parts of the world, divided, torn apart by conflicts, many of which had minority grievances or claims. Whether they were legitimate or real is another issue, but they did exist. And it was a time when it was felt within the OSCE, within the United Nations, within the Council of Europe, and the European Union, that certain steps had to be taken to acknowledge, refer to, if not legally protect, minority rights or minorities themselves. So this aspect is perhaps not always well understood or appreciated, that this was not accidental. It was a period in Europe and internationally when it was acknowledged that legal and political steps were needed to ensure peace and stability, but through justice and inclusion, and steps for the protection of minorities and their rights. And it was a promise of respect for human rights of minorities, I would suggest, by developing instruments to make this a reality on the ground. Now, many of you, and I was one of them, many of you might recall that this was a period of optimism. And perhaps that we were naive. We were perhaps naive to think that these promises, because, well, for the most part, they were positive developments, but they really were more in the sense of promises, commitments. There were commitments that things would progress. They would be applied. They would be implemented on the ground. But in the end, I think we have to be honest, they were not truly backed up by very solid enforcement mechanisms. The UN Declaration, well, as you all know, it's not a legal document. It's not a treaty. It's more in the nature of a solemn political statement of commitments, promises. The Framework Convention, now this might be, it's not really controversial, but there's some different opinions, but the Framework Convention is just that, a framework, not a directly applicable treaty in national law, despite a few experts who have tried to argue differently. The European Charter for regional or minority languages actually very clearly, without any ambiguity, by the way, it very clearly says that no one, no individual, no community have any rights under that treaty. It's a treaty, but you have no rights that you can claim. It creates obligations on states, and that's fair, that's okay. But can you actually try to enforce as an individual, as a community, in any way that you have rights in relation to your language and this under that treaty? No, you can't. Let's be honest here. And of course, as you all know, the European Court of Human Rights cannot be used directly as a court of law to try to ensure compliance with those two Council of Europe treaties. So you should answer your phones, or actually better turn it off, I think. In addition to that, the Council of Europe's Framework Convention and the European Charter treaties have very light enforcement mechanisms. And they do serve a purpose. I mean, it is good to actually work, collaborate, engage positively with states, and help them achieve the application, to achieve the mise en œuvre, the implementation of their commitments. And therefore, the enforcement mechanisms under those two Council of Europe treaties actually does that. And it can actually perhaps have positive effects or consequences. But it's very long processes, this review, periodic review. And there are times, quite clearly, and some might say too often, that countries and governments simply ignore the recommendations made under those periodic review mechanisms under the treaties. Some minorities actually have expressed grave frustration that the so-called rights that they have or believe they have, or at least legal obligations of states, can, under those two treaties of the Council of Europe, can be so easily dismissed. And that the periodical review procedures can take not only years, but even decades to progress, which means that there are situations where the violations of their rights are, well, kind of put aside, quite frankly, over periods of time. The cavalier way that legal commitments are being dealt with is, I would suggest, and I feel this is a very dangerous trend, is contributing to a loss of faith in the goodwill or effectiveness of regional mechanisms that you have here in Europe that were supposed to protect minorities, their cultures, their languages, and, or in short, their identities. At the European Union, and I know many minority groups, for example, were very optimistic and really wanted to engage directly, actively, intensely with the European Union, seeing it as a regional organization that perhaps had the greatest potential to protect their rights. Well, we saw, I think it was last year, a deeply disturbing development. Despite the massive backing of over 1 million EU citizens, the support of the European Parliament that was expressed in a resolution with over 75% of support of the votes cast, as well as a significant number of national and regional government endorsements, including the Bundestag of Germany, the Second Chamber of the Netherlands, the Parliament of Hungary, the Landtag of Schleswig-Holstein, Lower Saxony and Brandenburg, the Landtag of the government here of the province of Bolzano, South Tyrol, and the Frisian Parliament. And I might have missed some. Despite all of that, the European Commission simply said, no, we won't do anything. Forget it. Why? Because everything is perfect in the European Union in relation to, well, I'm sorry, that's an exaggeration. It was not necessary to take any further legal steps to protect minorities in the European Union because there were sufficient mechanisms and legal protections in place to protect the rights of persons belonging to national and linguistic minorities, and to strengthen the cultural and linguistic diversity in the Union. I think it would be healthy to be cynical, very frankly. It was not the view of the regional governments and even national governments that I mentioned in the list. It was not the view of more than 1 million EU citizens. So you have to wonder why this kind of situation is occurring, and to question the extent that minorities are truly legally protected in the European Union and in other areas such as the Council of Europe, as I mentioned. Efforts in the last 2 decades have been significant at the United Nations to respect, protect, and promote the human rights for vulnerable or marginalized groups, because we do have, and we have developed more in the last 2 decades and a bit before that, but we have legally binding treaties to protect the rights, for example, of refugees, migrants, women, of course, and children, persons with disabilities, and a number of others. But we have none for minorities. We don't actually have a treaty at the United Nations at the global level. Also at the United Nations, we're very good, by the way, at symbolic recognition. For all the groups that I mentioned, and quite a few others at the United Nations, we've adopted international days, weeks, or even decades to celebrate or mark their areas. For example, this decade, and in fact just yesterday in Paris, UNESCO launched the International Decade for Indigenous Languages. That people of African descent also have a number of these celebrations and various initiatives. And in the last decades, the last 20 years, for example, at the United Nations, what have we recognized for minorities? What kind of new initiatives have we developed for minorities? None, absolutely none whatsoever. And I find it rather ironic. Yesterday, I was in Paris. I was there to participate and speak at the launch of the International Decade for Indigenous Languages. So I was there, even though I am the UN Special Rapporteur on minorities. But I cannot participate in any kind of international recognition of minorities because it doesn't exist. There is none. So I have to go for indigenous languages and peoples for those kinds of events. Minorities have also had challenges in being heard and seen at the United Nations as compared to other groups, as well as not being supported by strong alliances of international and national NGOs and governments. Because those exist at the UN, we have all kinds of networks that exist to support, for example, the rights of children, women, indigenous peoples, migrants, people of African descent, and even peasants. We actually have various initiatives dealing specifically with peasants. But there's absolutely nothing for minorities. There is no voluntary fund, for example, provided, which is a special category of funding, which is where states contribute to encourage the participation of vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, in the activities of the United Nations, especially in New York, but also sometimes in Geneva. We have a lot of those for people of African descent, indigenous peoples, and so forth. But for minorities, once again, guess what? Zero, null. The particular vulnerability of other groups actually has led to the growing acknowledgement and addressing of concerns of the LGBTI community at the UN. And this has included the launching in 2013 of an OHER-led free and equal public information campaign aimed at promoting equal rights and fair treatment of LGBTI people in the UN and in the UN offices around the world. There's also other initiatives such as standards of conduct for business to tackle discrimination against LGBTI people. Extremely worthy approaches and necessary programs and initiatives for LGBTI community, for people of African descent also. We have a number of similar initiatives coming up. And once again, however, in the last 20 decades, 2 decades, 3 decades, in fact, absolutely nothing in the side of minorities. The second point this raises is the issue of what we are dealing with or what we should be looking at. In terms of the critique, in fact, of what's happening, of the current gaps and failures. Well, I'd like to start by quoting directly with perhaps one of the sharpest critiques of the current gaps and failures as to the protection of the human rights of minorities that I have heard for a very long time. And that was just a few weeks ago, last September in New York. And I'll quote him first directly. Quote, "There is a near complete failure to mainstream and integrate the rights of minorities at the United Nations, despite a 2013 guidance note at the time. Minorities are facing on a massive scale, as never before, threats of exclusion, discrimination, and even calls to genocide and crimes against humanity. It is not an exaggeration to say that there has been a regression in the level of recognition and protection of the human rights of minorities." Meine Damen und Herren, that was the United Nations Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, who actually acknowledged, he was speaking at the high-level event at the UN General Assembly in New York for the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities, about how we failed, how the international community, and in fact, implicitly, the United Nations itself has failed. His words, inaction and negligence. I said on the same occasion, and here I quote myself, by the way, I've never done that before. I feel funny, but I'm going to quote myself. "We can see outside this outright institutional neglect in addressing and tackling the human rights of minorities, and even reluctance in acknowledging that minorities are specifically and disproportionately targeted, we can see increased levels of hate speech, incitement to violence, scapegoating, and bigotry that has led to a more unstable and unjust world." End of quote. And I think I'm right, by the way. Of course I would, but I think I'm right because looking around us, I think we can all see that the world has become a more unstable and unjust place. And in this instability and injustice, very often who are at most at risk and targeted in many parts of the world, they tend to be minorities. We could give many examples of where you have conflicts, where minorities claim that they are excluded or marginalized or victims of discrimination. Think of the conflict in Cameroon, where you have an English-speaking minority that says that they are excluded, unfairly excluded in areas of education, employment, in the civil service, and in the use of their language in the justice system. These are human rights issues, if you think about it. The extent that they're valid or legitimate is another matter, but that kind of phenomenon is increasing. And I think this needs to be addressed, recognized, and understood if we are going to tackle some of the underlying causes of many conflicts in the world. And let me come back to the point I was referring to. We are seeing an increase of minorities actually being victims of discrimination and exclusion. Minorities represent more than 3/4 of the world stateless. They have no citizenship. And it's not by accident, by the way. Most of the world stateless, most of the people who have no citizenship are directly and intentionally excluded because of government legislation and policies that put aside certain minorities that are considered to not really belong. Example, the Rohingya in Myanmar. There's about 1 million of them who are not citizens. This, once again, is not an accident. These are usually people born generations, in fact, in the country whose identity papers and even cards of citizenship were removed gradually from the 1980s. It was a whole process that started a number of decades ago, which ultimately led to a particular minority because it had different ethnic, linguistic, and religious background that they were considered to not belong, to somehow being a threat, in fact, in Myanmar, to be very honest. Most of the world stateless are in that category. Most of the world stateless, or most of the stateless in Europe, are Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic states and Roma. It's not an accident. These are the result of certain policies, legislation, choices, which can be discriminatory. The number of conflicts in the world is increasing to an extent that we haven't seen for decades, once again. Most, not all, absolutely not, but most of these conflicts are internal, inside a country, and most involve minorities with grievances. Once again, not all. And whether the extent to which these grievances are legitimate is another issue. But the fact is, and this is, there are studies that refer to it and actually demonstrate it, including the first ever UN World Bank joint study on peace and conflict. All of these actually acknowledge that most of today's conflict is based on group grievances of exclusion and discrimination. To make it very simple, groups, and most of these groups, where you have the increasing conflicts around the world, involve minorities that claim that they are excluded or victims of discrimination. Now, of course, this does not mean that there is necessarily a direct correlation between the absence of a treaty for the rights of minorities and these human rights challenges. But what's the saying in English? Where there's smoke, there's fire, something like that. Well, I think there is something there that needs to be acknowledged, but you can only acknowledge if you actually name those who you do not want today. And in many cases, these are minorities that need to be addressed, their claims, their issues. So it should be obvious that actual implementation mechanisms and the clarification of the nature and extent of the legal protection of the rights of minorities, and also the need for elaborating what these rights are. What is the substance of the rights of minorities in areas such as citizenship, hate speech, and incitement to violence, and even genocide in social media. And finally, on approaches to avoid the instrumentalization of minority grievances that might lead to violence and conflict. You have to set these out in a rational, comprehensive way that addresses many of the world's new challenges. And that may be one of the reasons where the time has come to consider the adoption of a legal document, of a treaty that sets out what are the rights of minorities, what are the rights of those who are amongst the most marginalized, the most excluded, the most victims of discrimination, and where you have minority issues involved in most of the world's conflicts. I forgot to mention, and I really should, there is also an issue which is newish, relatively new, and that is the social media and the impact of social media, misinformation, disinformation, but also hate speech, and the effects of hate speech in reality. Words do matter. Words can lead to action. And as many of you know, more and more of the violent acts of violence done by lone wolves and others are actually the result of radicalization of hate speech through social media. And hate speech, which usually targets, can you guess? Minorities. Yeah, exactly. In fact, where we do have data, and data is always difficult to find, reliable data is difficult to find in many countries. But in most countries where we do have reliable data, it's very clear that around three quarters of hate speech and incitement to violence in social media targets minorities. Think of Muslims in India. There are many, many horrific cases there. Think of the hate speech that targets Roma. It's really not very nice, to say the least, but it's also increasing. Anti-Semitism in the United States, just recently, the Anti-Defamation League, which looks at anti-Semitism in the United States, reported that last year in 2021 is the highest level of anti-Semitism that they've ever recorded since they started recording anti-Semitic incidents in media generally. It's all increasing, Islamophobia in Europe and many parts of the world, and so on. All of this, therefore, we need to look at. These are amongst also new challenges, particularly the one I just mentioned, hate speech and incitement to violence in social media. But they are they are new phenomena, and they all reflect, I feel, and many also feel, the need to address a vacuum, a need to address the gaps and omissions, or even inaction and negligence, to use the word again of the UN Secretary General himself. Because the lack of clarity in terms of the rights of minorities and how states should address these, it creates opportunities for the perpetuation of hate speech and in bigotry and discrimination, even by governments themselves against minorities. Because, well, perhaps in part because there is a bit of denial. I must say, I have almost come to the conclusion towards the end of my mandate that within the international community, there is a denial that minorities are particularly targeted or affected sometimes. I'm always a bit perplexed where we have documents, or we've had incidents where you have minorities, for example, in Afghanistan. There was a school bombing relatively recently, and the school was a school attended by girls in Afghanistan. And I noticed that even the press release of the United Nations referred to the school and that it was young girls that were actually killed in this bombing in Afghanistan. It referred to the district where the bombing occurred, and then it stopped. And it was a form of denial because those girls, that school that was targeted, were girls in school of the Hazara minority, an extremely vulnerable minority in Afghanistan, where you have atrocities committed against them. And yet, there was an almost complete failure to recognize, this is from the UN, that there was a specific group targeted. It wasn't only girls, or it was not just girls in the school being killed by the extremist Daesh movement. I think it's Daesh. It was actually members of a minority, the Hazara minority themselves. Third and final point. Concerning and reinforcing what the UN Secretary General and myself said a few months ago about what needs to be done. The President of the UN General Assembly, Shaba Koroshi, urged countries to act urgently to protect the rights of minorities in their territories. He said that the ambition of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities was to create a world where minorities can freely practice their religion, freely engage in tradition, and freely speak in their own native language. And he said a world where diversity is seen as not as a liability, but as a strength. And he continued by adding that our task is strengthening the common ground that has already been agreed upon. Strengthening what? The recognition and the protection of the rights of minorities. This is what is needed. This is the direction, in fact, that he is pointing. This is the area where I indicated there was an urgent need. And it was the area where the UN Secretary General admitted that, well, what we've done until now is the inaction and negligence. Well, what can we do then? I think there at least is a willingness at the higher echelons of the United Nations to perhaps think or consider working towards a new treaty. And certainly, I must say, at the level of civil society around the world, the appetite for this seems clear. It's striking how at the ground level, amongst minority organizations and defenders, there was a near unanimous view that some kind of international legal protection was needed. Since 2018, my mandate has held with the coordination and organization of the Tom Lantos Institute, we've held 13 regional forums around the world in which some 2,000 minority representatives and activists have participated. And in fact, more than 5,000 when you count the participants in the UN Forum on Minority Issues that is held every year, 2 days every year in Geneva at the United Nations. And what happens is it's clear from the ground up, civil society, minorities themselves, whether this is in Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, one issue almost always, in fact, I would say always comes up from civil society: the need to protect, recognize the human rights of minorities, and specifically through a treaty to actually elaborate those rights. So let me summarize what has become apparent. First, we're not doing enough, clearly, at the international level. Minorities are the last major group at the United Nations, with no specific mechanism or initiative to strengthen the discussion even, or at least and the protection of their human rights, for their human rights. There is no permanent forum, there is no voluntary fund. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Many recommendations, and I want to emphasize this. This came from thousands of people from minority groups, Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. Many of their recommendations clearly show the need that this has to be dealt as a matter of urgency. People are getting desperate. They're actually losing faith in the United Nations itself and in international organizations. The only new development, as I said previously, has been the organization of regional forums done under my mandate, but that's actually almost not something that the United Nations has been most involved with. The most emphatic recommendation, which came from all of the forum, was the need for a legally binding treaty on minority rights with an implementation mechanism or some kind of oversight mechanism which would guide both states and non-state actors. It was widely considered as the best possible way forward for all the major stakeholders because it would provide an opportunity to channel minority activism, diplomacy, and expertise in a more systematic, long-term way, and consider ways to respond to many of the world's challenges and changes, including the impact of social media and the rise of hate speech and incitement to violence. And for minorities, it seems that such an instrument would need to be elaborated with their equal participation. To borrow from the indigenous peoples' approach and lobbying efforts, nothing about them without them. And this would give a chance to minorities to engage with the UN and states, not only as victims of human rights violations, but as responsible agents in the making of norms that govern their lives, our lives. It was also suggested that the UN Secretary General should commission a high-level panel to assess the inadequacies of the current normative regime, or lack of, and suggest current ways forward on a minority rights treaty. And on that point, let me just say, there's a saying, I think, that it's the most beautiful flowers that take the most time to bloom. Let's just hope that in the case of minorities and a minority rights treaty, that's also the case. Another one of the directions to fill gaps and omissions is to have a dialogue and to have a constructive conditions. And that requires more than just one United Nations forum for 2 days, once a year in Geneva, which is currently the case for the United Nations. It needs what is called a permanent forum, such as is the case for indigenous peoples, but also people of African descent, by the way, alternating between New York and Geneva. So there is a time and opportunity to truly engage with all interested parties, not be forced into an extraordinary tight 2-minute race to express all your hopes and grievances at the United Nations over a day and a half. Another point that came very often is the need to clarify the scope of international minority protection, focusing on certain groups which we don't always think of as minorities. There are groups that are caste or descent-based groups, the Dalits, sometimes you could say the Roma, and others, that are often quite excluded, but also immigrants. Immigrants are quite often, usually, also members of some minorities. In terms of substantive rights that need to be addressed, that could be addressed in the new treaty, well, you have issues such as citizenship, as I described earlier, the issue of statelessness, the right to citizenship without discrimination affecting particularly minorities, economic rights, including in relation to land, with a focus on sustainable and inclusive development of minority regions while protecting the natural environment, the right to participation in decision-making, which needs to reflect existing state practice, and also issues of autonomy. And here is where your region has a great deal to offer to the rest of the world. It is my firm belief that in the area of international law and the recognition and protection of minorities, the issue of autonomy has to be dealt with. And that, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is quite a big morsel, to use an expression. But it has to be dealt with, as the experience here in this region shows. Truly living or truly having unity in diversity quite often requires some kind of power share, a situation where minorities are assured of a fair share, not to the exclusion of others, but you have the right balance in the end within region where you do have diversity. And that is probably going to be one of the most challenging dimensions of any new attempt to have a treaty on the rights of minorities. But it is one which is, I think, clearly absolutely necessary, particularly because we see in countries where there are conflicts, that one of the essential tools to try to prevent or to stop conflict are autonomy arrangements. And since most of modern conflicts have a minority dimension, it is not possible to deal with that effectively without looking into issues of autonomy. Not everywhere, but in many cases. And another issue that came up is the urgent need to mainstream in the United Nations activities and structures, the human rights dimension of minorities, specifically those of marginalized minorities, and the sections within these minorities which are particularly vulnerable to abuse, such as in the case of minority women. Now, there are many examples that we could give, but it's not always appreciated that when you have an intersection of gender and membership of a minority, this in fact can double your vulnerability. For example, women of color who are politicians in the United States tend to be extremely targeted in the social media for hate speech. It is actually forms of harassment and threats which need to be acknowledged. There is an intersectionality aspect that is not always well understood. I myself also called for an action plan to strengthen the protection of minority rights and to have at the United Nations General Assembly the adoption of an international decade for minorities. And I also called for the creation of what is called a UN voluntary fund to financially support minority-related activities at the UN, as well as regional activities. Can any of this be done? We can dream, can't we? But more than that, unless we actually go into the path of trying to strengthen and improve, no progress will be made. And currently, we are seeing extremely dangerous situations, extremely difficult situations. And some would say, well, you're dreaming. All of this is currently impossible. Governments, because when you have a treaty, governments must actually approve the treaty. The drafting of the treaty in the final stages is by governments. The context is not good. You know that there are governments, national governments, which are completely opposed to even talking about minorities currently. That's true. But when you consider all the challenges that we have, how dark the world has become, it is perhaps in the darkest moments that we really have to focus on the light and try to improve the situation. Because if we don't, it won't get any better. And so perhaps, despite the negative environment that we have, despite the very contrary context that we have, now might actually be the right moment to press forward and to try to obtain changes that are needed to address hate speech, to address calls to genocide against minorities, incitement to violence, and the causes of many of the world's conflicts. And to do that, we have to name those who will not be named. We have to recognize that what is needed is the protection of minorities and also to ensure that their human rights are identified, clearly identified in a legal document, so that we can address some of these greatest challenges that we have in the current period through which we are living. Grazie mille, danke schön, merci beaucoup.
So, thank you very much, Fernand, for your considerations and reflections on the state of the art of minority rights in the world. And also your, I have to say, your words were very pessimistic, quite critical. So I'm usually pessimistic too, but I'm gonna, as a reaction, I'm gonna try to be more optimistic. And I want also to welcome Arno Kompatscher, the president of the province of Bolzano, Bozen, and I will ask him to address perhaps the concluding remarks. If you agree, first I will open a bit the debate, but first I will break the ice with a question, and then so please prepare your questions. We are also, as I said at the beginning, live streaming. So there are two classes from Innsbruck and the University of Innsbruck and Florence on live. And I invite them also to raise questions. That's why I'm looking at the computer, because I'm waiting for the questions. So I have many comments, I have 2 pages of comments, but I will reduce to a very first one question, and it's about, because you focus a lot on the necessity to have a treaty on minority rights or minorities. And as we know, one of the main problems of minority rights is the lack of a legally binding definition of minorities. So it's a sort of elephant in the room. So we are talking about a treaty, but we don't have yet a definition of minorities. My first point. And one of the problems of minorities, we know that the definition also is, and you mentioned the reluctance of many countries to use, even to mention the concept or the term minorities. But we also have to recall that there are also minorities, let's say communities, groups, individuals themselves that refuse and reject the term minority. They don't want to be called minorities. It's for many a sort of pejorative term. It's might refer, also imply a sort of second-class citizenship. So it's something that we also have to address, have to understand and address. And also the concept of the factor of vulnerability. We use it, I share with you also this use, and in many instances, in many contexts, it is true, but vulnerability is not actually a sort of essential element of minorities. And so it's not, this is the sort of anti-essentialist critique, as if vulnerability were a sort of trait of minorities by definition. And so all of these difficulties, obviously, and the problem of individual collective rights, make adopting a legally binding treaty obviously very complicated. And so I'm wondering, how do you see this? The willingness of states, I don't think is very open, but also the minorities themselves are probably not willing to have a treaty of this type. Please.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I would say the opposite. It is a treaty would actually be the container of the appropriate container of a definition. And so therefore it's a little bit, I want to turn that around and to say, well, to clarify what is it, and to set aside any misconception as to what are minorities, then the treaty is the proper medium or proper container for that. By the way, one of my latest reports to the UN General Assembly, or 2 of my reports to the UN General Assembly, actually elaborated on the concept of minorities, more from the international perspective than the European one, because there are some There are some differences. And so there is if you really want to have a clear definition of what is a minority, please refer to my 2019 report to the UN General Assembly, although I focus more on linguistic, religious, and ethnic minorities. All joking aside, the reason there is such a contested, and if you will, even contradictory views as to a minority is the absence of a definition in a treaty. If you had a legal definition, then you have a certain degree of clarity that would be in place. It's not easy to obtain because you have to have a consensus of the member states who actually are involved in the drafting of the treaty or who would would ratify that. But I think we should not, there are two aspects. One aspect of your question is that it is the absence of a definition that actually creates uncertainty even amongst certain communities. They sometimes believe that the concept of minority means one of weakness or of being secondary or not quite equal citizens, or somehow has a negative connotation. All of that, I firmly believe, would be addressed and redressed if one had an appropriate and clear definition, and that can only be achieved by having a treaty. So in a way, you're making my argument that maybe a treaty is needed. However, may I point out that this is sometimes raised in a way which I think is exaggerated also. I have had situations, and I remember this occurring. I had a discussion with officials at the United Nations when I was preparing for a mission to Spain. And I indicated I would be meeting with members of the Catalan minority. And these are UN officials. And the reaction of some UN officials was, well, you can't do that. They don't consider themselves a minority. And I indicated, well, no, I have individuals, people who are Catalans, who want to talk to me because they consider themselves to be at least a linguistic minority. They consider themselves to be also a nation and a people, but these do not exclude also the possibility of being a linguistic minority inside of Spain. So I just bring that up as a caution to not exaggerate the belief that many groups do not want to be labeled a minority because they feel it's a weaker category or negative category. I actually think that's quite often exaggerated. And the number of groups that I've met who I was told at the United Nations, you can't because they are not minorities. They do not like to be called minorities. When I explained to them that the concept of minority at the United Nations, the one I presented to the UN, is basically a numerical category inside of the whole state in relation to language, religion, or culture, there's no negative connotation. And I can tell you, in fact, this is public, the United Nations Forum on Minority Issues in Geneva was just held a few weeks ago. And one of the minority spokesperson was the president of the Generalitat of Catalonia. Excuse me. If he, as president of Catalonia, agrees and speaks about the Catalans as a minority, what on earth are you afraid of? Seriously. So I think there's an exaggerated fear, but partially the fear of some groups, and it is legitimate, I've heard this from some communities, they think it means that you're inferior. Because there is no definition, they assume that it's something to do with non-dominance or inferiority. If you had a clear, objective, rational definition from a legal point of view, many of those fears, I think, would actually be set aside.
Collect some questions from the audience, if you have any. Yes, I have a couple of questions from those attending the event online. Okay, the capo torti definition has been covered, and there is a question on the.
Actually, can I just pick you up on that? I'm sorry.
Please.
The capotorti definition, you're getting me going here. It was rejected by the Commission on Human Rights. I still have problems understanding why scholars always refer to capotorti. His definition was not accepted. That's why the UN Commission on Human Rights asked a second expert, Judge Deschênes from Canada, about 10 years later, can you try? Because capotorti did not succeed. And people forget this. And I think it has to be understood that there is a context.
But also your Canadian compatriot did not succeed either.
No.
So as now, capotorti was. Actually, it's very much quoted. It's true, because many national legislation actually refer somehow to that definition. But no, a second question is about the concept of minority protection and autonomy. These concepts are often confused. Autonomy does not necessarily mean minority protection, but can minority protection work without a certain degree of self-government or autonomy?
Sure. No, sorry. Yes, I think there are situations, if I can use a Canadian example, I think the Canadian example, you have autonomy and non-autonomy arrangements. In the case of Canada, let's say on the language issue with the French-speaking minority. By the way, we don't have issues with saying minority in the case of the French-speaking population. The autonomy arrangement relates to the province of Quebec, where most French-speaking people live, obviously, where they're concentrated. And clearly, even in terms of Canada as a federation, but the province of Quebec has different powers, different authority, and in some cases, more authority than other provinces, in part of recognition that of the French language and culture that is considered to be an important component of the Canadian federalism. But in addition to that, there is a non-territorial aspect, non-autonomy aspect, because language rights in Canada in certain areas can be exercised throughout the country. In some places, basically based on the local population, if there's a sufficient demand, but essentially it's non-territorial, particularly in the area of criminal law, where if you're accused of a federal crime, you have a right to be heard in your own language, not through an interpreter, but with actually lawyers and judges being able to understand you. So there are elements of both, and I want territorial and non-autonomy and non-autonomy arrangements. And in the case of the French language protection outside of Quebec, for the French-speaking minority outside of Quebec, I would say they work relatively well, not perfect, but they do exactly protect this linguistic minority in many areas, particularly education.
You have any questions, please raise your hand. I have a third question from the online audience. We hear a lot about successful minority protection in South Tyrol, Åland Islands, other parts of Europe. Which less known examples do you know that are worth looking at in terms of minority protection?
Many thanks, and that's a very good question. I think the Åland Islands, we tend to forget. Mm-hmm. In fact, I mentioned that because it is a rather unique in a sense. It's the only legacy, I think, from the period of the First World War that has remained. Many of you who have studied history of the rights of minorities, you referred to it, Roberta, I think, at the beginning, the minority treaties between the two world wars. Well, the Åland Islands emerged during this period. It's not exactly the same phenomenon, but it was during this period. And it is the only, actually, minority arrangement that survived. And I would say it has survived very effectively in the sense that the Swedish-speaking minority in Finland living in the Åland Islands are very secure in their language, and they have a great deal of autonomy. I think the financial arrangement is also an important component, which we tend to forget. And I would consider that perhaps one of the lesser, very good examples of good practices linking the protection of a minority and an autonomy arrangement. And if you really want to dig a little bit more, what is interesting is whereas the Swedish-speaking minority in the Åland Islands are doing quite well, when you look at the Swedish-speaking minority on the mainland of Finland, they're not doing so well. They don't have the same autonomy arrangement in Finland that the other island has. And I think there's a lesson there to be learned, which we should actually keep in mind.
Please, pardon, yes.
1 second.
Sorry. No, concerning the question about autonomy and if it works or not and best practices, I had the occasion now to study the 360 minorities in Europe. So I not have data from the whole world, about 360 minorities in Europe. So where we have data, reliable data, 2/3 of these 360 minority decreased sharply. So I agree with you, we cannot be too optimistic because data show, even in Europe, where I think we are protected, 2/3 of minorities decreased sharply in the last 30 years. Then we have a certain number of minorities where we don't know because there are no data. Sometimes there are data quoted from the 20 years, so about 100 years ago. They're not existing anymore in this concept. And then we have about 30, 40 minorities increasing in Europe. And when we look what are the conditions of these 30, 40 minorities increasing in Europe, they have a dedicated autonomy. So the autonomy was not made for a country like a German Bundesland. They have an autonomy, a special autonomy, like Åland Islands, like South Tyrol, like East Belgium for the German minority there. And second one, and this maybe is underestimated, if we are speaking about linguistic minorities, minorities increasing use a standard language. They are not using dialects, they are using standard languages. And there are other criteria also, but it's a very impressive thing to learn about this data, where they have a minority and where they are using a standard language. There are possibilities for a minority to increase. So I would say it's not a natural law that minorities must decrease, but they need conditions to have this. So I would be very, very happy if the UN or even Europe would change this idea that to be a minority is a personal issue like religion. No, it's not a personal issue. It's a general society issue. And therefore, again, at least for Europe, minorities have possibilities in autonomy's region. And therefore, if we can learn something about the situation, states should provide autonomy. I know it's easy to say it in reality, but at the end, what is an autonomy? You said before power sharing. I see it as division of work. Our society has grown in the last centuries because work was divided between specialists, and also an autonomy, in my eyes, is nothing other than a centrum giving the task for some topics where the region is better to solve a problem. And this is autonomy, in my eyes. So.
If I may just react, thank you very much for that. And that is an extremely important point. In fact, one of my reports was on the socioeconomic participation of minorities. And the issue of employment for minorities is central to their maintenance of their culture and language, particularly where the state, the civil service, the employment opportunities are connected with the use of minority language. I'm very interested in your data and your research. So I think I will use you. I'm sorry if I very mercenary in that sense, but I think what you say is extremely important. And if I may have a chance to actually bring that up at the global level with the United Nations, I would be very delighted to do so. So if you could, I'd like to get the fruits of your labor in that sense. Thank you.
I have a last question from, again, the online audience, from Peter Hilpold, professor at the University of Innsbruck. And it says, Professor de Varennes, dear Fernand, you have drawn a rather disappointing picture of the Forum on Minority Issues as to its actual potential. So one could say that the working group on minorities, operative between 1995 and 2006, represented a more efficient instrument for minority protection. The reform of 2007 was therefore a setback.
Hello, Peter. How are you? No, Peter, you're wrong. No, I think one has to see the limits. And the limits is that the difference with the early period of the working group on minorities and today's context with the UN Forum on Minority Issues is the expansion and greater accessibility for minorities. We, in the last few years at the UN Forum on Minority Issues, we had more than 500 participants registered. And we only have 2 days. In fact, the situation is one where minorities want to speak, they want to engage, they actually are able to be there in Geneva much more than 20 years ago. That simply did not happen. It's not that it is a failure as such, it is simply that the world has changed. And because now we clearly, and by the way, this is in one point which is not always appreciated in Europe, when we talk about minorities, we also talk a lot about religious minorities. And that in many parts of the world is an extremely important and challenging area. So it is more that the UN Forum needs to do a lot more. And quite clearly, we should have what at the United Nations is called a permanent forum, a forum that lasts weeks, not 1.5 days in Geneva. That actually is almost, I was going to say insulting, but is completely inappropriate for, in fact, the degree and importance of minority issues for minorities themselves. So I think we have to understand what is involved here. It's not that the UN Forum has no use. It's simply that it has to be much more to really address what we have in terms of challenge, but also of minorities themselves wanting to be part of the problem. Don't talk about us, work with us to deal with these issues around the world.
So thanks a lot, Fernand, for your thoughts, your words. It's also always a pleasure to exchange and talk with you. And I will give the floor now to Arno Kompatscher for his final remarks. Thanks, please.
Okay. Final remarks is a big word because I only have, maybe a few ideas. First of all, thank you to Eurac. Thank you for doing this, for this event. Thank you, Mr. Special Rapporteur Fernand de Varennes, for being here. Thank you once again for inviting me to the UN Forum, to the event where we celebrated the 30 years of the UN Declaration. It was not only very important for me, it was, I think, very important for South Tyrol too, for our autonomy to be there, present, not as the model. We are not the model of the way how you can solve a conflict, but maybe we are just one example where it worked quite well. And this was for me the opportunity just to say there are, of course, a few elements, and you mentioned them, which are very important if you want to protect a minority. First of all, of course, you have to address it. You have to give a name to those who often don't have a name. First of all, you have to recognize it. There is a minority, even if it's religious, ethnic, linguistic. But this is not enough, of course. You have to have an idea of the rights you have to protect. So which are the rights of minorities? Of course, they are human rights. But it's not the case that citizenship, for example, was one of the main issues we had in our basic treaty, the Grupo de Gasperi Treaty from 1946. The first question was how all the people who went away during the options could have back a citizenship here, the Italian citizenship in that case. And it's often just this basic thing missing. And then, of course, it's about use of native language, having school teaching in this language. But all the cultural matters, issues, but then you have to have the socio-economic context. You need jobs, you need employment. In our case, it was public service, to have, again, this possibility to be assumed in public service, and it was the idea of this proportionality system we created. And often when we discuss about this system nowadays, we say, well, it's quite anachronistic. We don't need it anymore because, of course, we have full employment. So nobody has a problem. But if we didn't, what would happen? So this is to have a framework, a legal framework, which gives protection, then maybe it can happen that you don't need it every day, but it's important to have it. And we have just one thing, we have this autonomy too. Fernand, before, when you said, of course, it is possible to protect minorities without autonomy, but it's difficult. And maybe it doesn't work so well. I said, don't say this in South Tyrol. For us, it is clear that you have to have autonomy. It is necessary because the other way, the only way could be that all these rights addressed to the minority have to be implemented for the whole state, for the whole nation. This is the other way to do it. In Canada they do it well, quite well, but normally you have a territorial aspect in a minority situation. It's just part of a country. And so the idea of autonomy is the simplest way just to deal with it, to give the possibility to solve the problems there where they are. Problems, minority are not a problem. They are an added value, of course, but the problem to deal with the idea of staying together of different cultural groups, and one of them in a numeric less situation. So they are less than the others. Then this is the simplest and, for me, the strongest definition of minority. If a group are less than the other, than the majority, even if they're religious group, cultural group, ethnic group, linguistic group, they are less. And so if this is a territorial aspect issue, so you can deal with it with an autonomy. We have this 50 years right now. We celebrated it last year. And of course, we try to share our experience because often it is seen as a model. I say I prefer an example. It can work. Of course, we were very lucky. We have to say this because if we see all these minorities all over the world, and you mentioned it, and all the problems we have, and you started quite pessimistic. I heard the last part of your speech. It was at the end quite optimistic. We can do something, and maybe if we are in this bad situation of all these crises we are living in now, maybe this is, I agree with you, this is the right moment just to try to do something. And I think that we were lucky because we had a kin state, we have a treaty. Yeah. But we see that there are many situations of minorities, not only in Europe, in many countries, where it could be possible to have two states to make a treaty, if there's a will to do it. Yeah. If there's a recognition of the minority situation of a minority of another state in the country. Otherwise, if you don't have this situation, you need even more a definition and a treaty. because otherwise, how can you arrive to a situation where the state itself does the things that have to be done? We in South Tyrol, of course, try to develop our autonomy because it's a never-ending story. Protecting of minorities, we have to deal with new situations. We have new groups here in South Tyrol. We started with the German-speaking, the Italian-speaking, and the Latins. But nowadays we have thousands and thousands of people coming from other countries, immigrants, and they are, again, minorities in our situation. And not only linguistic or cultural minorities, religious minorities at the same time. And so we have to find a way how our system of protection can work for them too, of course. But not only that, we have to deal with all new legislation in Europe, in Italy, and we have always to try to find arrangements. But we have even for this a system, this bilateral commission, with this enacting decrees of autonomy, gives us the opportunity just to keep on developing our autonomy. And this is maybe one element more. You have to have these systems just to go on with it. A static autonomy will not work. What are we doing? We try to do our best for our autonomy, but we would like to do even more than we did in the last years, and here Eurac did a lot. Yeah, we would like to share our experience. When we celebrated the 30 years of the closure of the struggle in front of the United Nations, you told us it's not only a shared responsibility between Austria and Italy, our autonomy, it's a responsibility to share our autonomy with the world. Maybe this today is just one moment of it, and we will try to do more in the next years. And of course, we would like to try to do it with Eurac, with other of course, institutes, with all the scientific community. But not only that, we would try to do it with the people too. Not talk about minorities, but talk with minorities at the same time. And maybe I can close with this, just to say tomorrow we will have the opportunity just to announce one important new step. We will have this wonderful library, a library where we will have the 3 native languages here they're all native, all the 3. The Italian are natives too here, yeah. We had always an Italian minority in South Tyrol, even before fascism and the separation from the north. The 3 languages, but not only that, the idea to make there a center for minorities. Of course, we will talk about autonomy too, but autonomy is one element for minority protection. We have our autonomy just for this goal. And I always tell this to my colleagues in the Conferenza delle Regioni in Italy, because we are talking about more autonomy to all the regions right now. It's the new government is trying to adopt, which is written in the Article 116 of our constitutions, to give more autonomy to the normal regions. And they'll say, well, this is good, because to be autonomous in a more federalistic context is better for us. It's easier to deal with the central government. But at the same time, I say always, but it will never be the same, because an autonomy with the goal of a minority protection is different. And this is our case. And so we will talk about autonomy, but most of all about minority protection, and we would like to be not so selfish as we are always. Yeah, we always say South Tyrol, and we are doing so good. Well, there are a lot of situations which are not doing so bad. The Åland Islands, of course, but not only Eastern Belgium and a lot of others in Europe too. But mostly we would try to help all those minorities. And there are so many, you mentioned it before, which are not protected right now. And maybe with this center, we can just contribute a little bit for it. Thank you for your attention. We'll leave it.
So with these closing remarks, close also the event of today. Thanks again to the audience here present and also those online, and to Fernand de Varennes, obviously. And so thanks a lot, and goodbye.